don't, does anybody else in here know Majestic Pierre?
Just who he is.
Okay, let me give an update on him. For a long time, he was here at ACU studying to get a degree, and he got his degree, went back to Haiti, where he and his father, and I don't know who else, started this home for orphans that was called the Goodness of God Orphanage. Well, sometime, I don't know exactly when, probably 2 years ago even, he was threatened by gangs.
I think I remember that. Yes.
And he and his wife left Haiti, went to Mexico, and for probably as much as a year even, tried to get kind of permanent status there. And it finally happened.
Okay.
That's a thank you. They have papers that say that they can stay there, they can work, he and his wife. And anyway, that's something we can be really grateful for, I think.
Okay. I think I have met him only once. I know who he is, and I'm aware of the orphanage, but that's about all that I know. So no, I hadn't heard that.
Fine young man.
Yeah.
I remember all the problems he had to get over here.
Yes.
So Mexico is a new home base of operations then.
I guess.
So is the orphanage still going?
I think his father, okay, I get the monthly bulletin from them, and I'm guessing that his father or someone else is still running the orphan. It's not really an orphanage now. They had, because the state took away some of their children. I don't know what happened there, but they're now conducting it as a school.
Okay.
And they have, I think, 30 or 40 kids that they are trying to take care
Sure.
of and teach and whatnot. So they have not given up the work there. I mean, it's still ongoing, but I don't know who's running it, but I think his dad.
Okay.
But because I know he and his dad were instrumental in getting it started.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning, and thank you for letting me.
You're welcome. The Exodus study concludes today, and we'll begin with a little review, but next week, for a few weeks, we'll do an Advent study. I think last week I said that the 28th we won't have class, and I believe we will not have class on the 21st, which is the Sunday, the way the calendar falls. That's the Sunday before Christmas, and the 28th is between Christmas and New Year's. So if memory serves, we always suspend classes the week between, and I did not remember that we usually also do the 2 weeks around the holidays. That's because we have a lot of teachers that are traveling and a lot of people that are traveling. So the next, let's see, the 30th, the 7th, and the 14th, 3 weeks, the next 3 weeks, Lord willing, we'll do an Advent study. I think, if I can do this today, I think we'll wind up in John 1 by the time we're done today. Believe it or not. How am I going to get from Exodus 34 and Exodus 40 to John 1? Well, I didn't really set out to get there, but I got there. You just turn it over. Yes. The more that I was kind of thinking through and reading through, and as I got into planning out the lesson, I got to John 1. Okay, so having said that, if you look through the heart of the Exodus 20s, really chapter 20 all the way through about 30, 31, about 10 chapters, fairly systematic and detailed instructions about the tabernacle and the furnishings and the accoutrements and everything that we should have in place to facilitate worship and sacrifice. Okay, so you remember all of those instructions. Those are the instructions on the heels of the Ten Commandments. And that's been about the last third of the book are those very detailed instructions. All of this comes on the heels of the giving of the law. God has acted for his people. He has brought them out of Egypt because he is faithful to his promise to Abram. The goal of the promise to Abram is to bless all people in all places. All of the creation, all of humanity. We see against the backdrop of the nations of the earth and all of their kind of the collective pride, as it were, displayed when they build the tower and the city at Babel. They should go out and spread and multiply and fill the earth, and instead they concentrate and build a city and build a tower and want to build a name for themselves. The focus of the narrative drills down on one man against the backdrop of all the people groups. One man, Abram. Abram, I will take you to a place that I'll show you, and I'll make you into a great nation for the sake of blessing all nations. And by the time we get through the narrative of Genesis, this family has blossomed into a nation, but they're not in the land. So we need to get the people of God and the land of God, and then from there we'll be in a position, again, in the narrative flow of the Exodus, Genesis and Exodus story, we'll be in a position, we'll be where we need to be from Genesis 12. And we get there. And they are oppressed by the Egyptians, and God has brought them out. He has acted for their good, and not just for their good, but for the sake of all peoples. We need to form this nation into a nation that resembles Yahweh God, their creator God, who has fashioned them and formed them. So if we were to study Leviticus, one of the refrains that happens over and over as you go through the law in Leviticus, be holy for I am holy. And some of you are nodding, you've read enough in Leviticus, that refrain happens repeatedly. Too often to just be a one-off or a coincidence. It's just a keynote that gets played over and over as you read through Exodus. Be holy for I am holy. I know it can be challenging to kind of get a handle on all of the laws, plural, and get a handle on the law kind of as a singular entity. So I would say one of the kind of centers of gravity for understanding the law is the intent of the law, which is to fashion a people that is holy because God is holy. The values of the law reflect the character of Yahweh. So again, Kevin, as you prayed, the law about the margins of the field. When you harvest, don't be so stingy that you get every last kernel of wheat. If you leave some, you leave some. And the people who don't have anything can come along and there's provisions for them. When you do this, it reflects the character of Yahweh. When you don't do that, it reflects the character of Yahweh. So all of those individual laws, when you trickle down to all these various scenarios, if this is the case, then you do that. Case law. It's also true of just the statement, the unequivocal statement, thou shalt do this. They reflect the character of Yahweh. Because he is holy, the nation that obeys these laws, the nation that lives by this covenant, embodies his holiness in how they live. The stipulations give definition for what it means to be in covenant relationship with Yahweh. So in chapter 20, the giving of the Ten Commandments, there's kind of a small version of the law. I don't know if it's a condensed version, but there's a few, 20, 21, 22, and then there's all this section of the accoutrements of the tabernacle, and then we get to the statement in 31 about the Sabbath. We talked about that. That's a frame for the whole thing. The whole thing is framed by God's work in creation, and when this nation rests, they make a theological statement or a doctrinal statement about what's most important for them, which is they live and are sustained by the work of God. That's critical. Their whole existence on a rhythmic pattern every week reminds them we are who we are because what God has done for us. We live because what God has done for us. We survive not because we work hard. We survive because God provides. We can rest on one day because God upholds all of it, all of our days. So every day we work by the labor of our hands, and we could well work on 8 days out of 7. We could not work nonstop and fall into the trap of thinking we provide for ourselves. Well, you work 6 and you rest on 7 because God provides, and because God has brought us out of Egypt. So this command about the Sabbath that we see in chapter 31, it's connected to what I have done to bring you out. I have brought you out. So the defining moment for us as a people is the Exodus. And as the generations pass and your children ask you, why do we not work on this day? You tell them because God has brought us out, and we were under hard, forced labor. And we worked, and we worked, and we worked. But God has brought us out. So the giving of the law, the framework, just the doctrinal framework of the whole thing points back to what God has done for them. Which is why, when you get to chapter 32, it's so tragic that in the mystery, the scene on the mountain, Moses goes up. We don't know where he is. We don't know if he's coming back, and we don't know what's. They cry out, "Make gods for us." And so Aaron, the verbs here are significant. Aaron does something that God tells Israel to do in all those chapters in the 20s. Make this, make that, make it like this, make it just so, make it this way, make it this long, make it this wide, make it this high, make it of this material, fashion, make. Okay? Look at chapter 32, verse 4. They cry out, "Give us gods. Make gods for us." That man who brought us out, we don't know what happened to him. Make us a god. And so Aaron takes up the gold and he fashions the gold. He does what God has told Israel to do as they make to the tabernacle. He says, "Israel, these are your gods who brought you up." There is some. It's hard to see how more fundamental this could have gone off the rails than this. It really kind of throws the whole thing into jeopardy. In fact, if you were to look at 32 and 33, God just wants to start again. So as you, again, big picture, we're reading Exodus, we see the big sweep of things. We wonder if there is a future for this people. Is there any way forward? Or is it over? And I'm just trying to think. Boil it down, just get right down to the essence of the matter. Is there a future for us? Okay, that's a good question. We see in this narrative, you're going to read 32, 33, 34, and then on after that, we see how close we came to there not being a future. Okay? But we do have a future, and so the question is, why do we have any hope to start again? Okay. Well, we get to chapter 34, and after this series of dialogues between Yahweh and Moses, we have this renewal. I will relent, there will be a future. And the covenant is re-given, in a sense, a new set of stone tablets. See 34, verse 1. Write on them the words that were on the first one. A fresh start. Come back up to Sinai. We're going to start again. So, verse 4, Moses cuts 2 stone tablets like the first, and he goes up. Verse 5, the Lord comes down. We don't have red letters in the Old Testament. Okay, you have red letters in the gospel so you can see the words of Jesus. Best I can tell, I think the first English editions to do that were about 1901. As a printing convention, someone decided we needed to, if we had a way to see the words of Jesus, we'll print those in red. Okay. As a kid, I always wondered, well, God speaks in the Old Testament too. Why isn't that? Things you wonder when you're 10 years old as a kid. Bored in church, I might add. My mind was wondering, why don't they put the Old Testament words of God in red? Well, if we did, Yahweh speaks a pretty significant paragraph. The Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord, Yahweh, is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin. He will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the father's iniquity on the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. Okay? Moses knelt low and worshiped. He says, if I have found favor, go with us. Even though this is a stiff-necked people, go with us. Forgive our iniquity, our sin, and accept us as your own possession. Yahweh responds. The Lord responded, I am making a covenant. I will perform wonders in the presence of all your people that have never been done in the whole earth or in any nation. All the people you live among will see the Lord's work, for what I am doing with you is awe-inspiring. Observe what I command you today. I'm going to drive these people out. Do not make a treaty with them. Okay, I'll summarize all those nation groups in verse 11. Those folks were living in Canaan. Do not make a treaty with them, otherwise they will become a snare among you. Instead, tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, chop down their Asherah poles, because the Lord is jealous for his reputation. You are never to bow down to another god. Do not make a treaty with them. There's a long speech here. Okay, verse 15. Do not intermarry with them, because the intermarriage has consequences. You'll take their daughters as brides for your sons. Their daughters will prostitute themselves with their gods and cause your sons to prostitute themselves with their gods. That prostitution motif is very common, kind of equivalent for idolatry. The idea of betrayal. Do not make cast images of gods for yourselves. Feast of unleavened bread. And then on we go. And there's quite a bit, most of 34. Okay? We, in a sense, renew covenant. There's some specific stipulations, and some of them echo the Ten Commandments. We're going to start again. Okay. A couple things to note. This renewal is rooted in God's character. He is compassionate and gracious. We're not starting again because we've got grace prospects. You look at Israel, the prospects aren't great, okay? So the renewal isn't rooted in their potential, their untapped potential. If they could just kind of look within themselves, if they could look within themselves and ponder the possibilities, maybe they could be great, okay? The future does not lie in their potential to be great. If you're looking for a future there, there is no future there. Where is the future secure? The future is secure because a gracious God makes a promise. That's why the future is secure. Now, they should honor the Torah, the instruction, the law, because the law itself reflects the character of God. But the future is secure because of who God is. And the implications are that Israel ought to obey the law because it shows us who God is and therefore who we ought to be. Okay. Notice, if you will, a couple times this notion of do not make a treaty with these people shows up in 34. Drive them out. We've already seen a couple instances. One, Moses' father-in-law. Remember, he was a foreigner, but he had great perception of who God is and what God was up to. So it kind of stepping back from a distance, we already have seen in some cases where foreigners who were not within the covenant community of Israel, not ethnically Jewish or Israelite, they had eyes to see and saw. We also saw groups who, when Israel comes through, provoke them and attack them and oppose their being in the land. Okay, I think that for me is the most helpful way to account for what we see in this storyline, which is people groups who oppose Israel and in this case drive them out kind of passages. We see some who are responsive to Yahweh. We see in some cases laws about the foreigners who were among you. So there were foreigners among them. And the foreigners, to use the language of the intertestamental period or the language of the first century, the God-fearers. Ethnically, they're not Jewish, but they have eyes to see, or they would be proselytes or converts. Bring them in. The whole goal is to bring in the nations. And as I read through passages like this, the instructions to oppose them or to drive them out, how can we explain that? The way that I explain it, for me, there is some hostility on their part. There is some opposition to what God is doing on their part. There is some unwillingness to turn from not just their deities, but the consequences that those deities have. The sort of built-in inner logic of those belief systems. And we get to a passage in Kings to illustrate. Okay. Drive them out. I don't think, again, as a blanket statement, I don't think in general terms these folks were totally innocent bystanders. Their belief systems had consequences, horrific consequences. All of those were not spelled out explicitly in Exodus 34, but they're embedded in those belief systems. That's how I make sense of this. Without getting into a lot of detail, I do want to give an example. Okay, do not make treaties. I'm not quite sure. Exodus certainly is used and read in the post-exilic period, the period after the exile, after Babylon takes Judah and literally take the Jews from Palestine to Babylon. Okay, let's look at 2 Kings. I'd mentioned this before, but I want to actually go to a place in 2 Kings and show you. It's pretty forceful in Exodus. Do not make treaties with these nations. And we kind of scratch our heads and we think, well, what's the problem with a treaty? Okay, I think the great problem with a treaty is, why would you make one? Well, that's a good question. Why does one make treaties with other nations in the 1st or 2nd millennium BC in Palestine? Why would one make a treaty? That's a good question. Okay. Palestine, where it is, between modern-day Iraq and Egypt, that little land bridge between Africa and Asia, was a hotly contested land bridge for trade reasons. Money, 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 money. If you control the trade routes, you're in a strategic position. If you are aligned with Egypt, your economic superpower neighbor to the south, you have extended their influence north. If you align with Babylon, or the folks up in the north and northeast, then you have extended their influence and control to the south. If you've got two great superpowers on either side of you, then you're the pawn in the middle, and you're always wooed and courted or threatened. Sometimes politicians will woo you, sometimes they will threaten you. Okay? I got a deal you can't refuse, It's very tempting to make a treaty to keep things safe. It's very easy to imagine a future that could really go off the rails unless we make a treaty, because the treaty will keep us safe. You see how the rationale would work. Look at 2 Kings 24. Jehoiakim makes a treaty with Babylon. And that is the end of the story for Judah. Why is that the end of the story for Judah? Because the powerful Babylonians do as they please with the little client king Israel in Judah. In other words, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because those things never work. That's why it didn't work. It never works. It could never work. It will never work. Not just pragmatically, but theologically, it won't work. Go back to 2 Kings 21. If you look in 2 Kings, this happened because Manasseh was so bad. Okay, what was so bad about Manasseh? Some of the very same things that we saw in Exodus. You go to the end of the story, look at 2 Kings 21. Manasseh, 12 years old when he comes to the throne, okay, reigned 55 years. Verse 2, he did what was evil in the Lord's sight, imitating the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites. That's our story in Exodus. This is referring back to the narrative that we read in Exodus. What was so bad? Okay, that's a good question. Here it's explicit. He rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed and reestablished the altars of Baal. I've been told it's probably pronounced Baal, unless you're from Tennessee, or we can say Texas, and then it's Baal, okay? Baal. He made an Asherah. That's mentioned in Exodus. As King Ahab of Israel had done, he bowed in worship to the stars and the sky and served them. He built altars in the Lord's temple. Okay, by this point, he built an altar in the temple. Verse 6, he sacrificed his son in the fire, practiced witchcraft and divination, consulted mediums and spiritists. He did a huge amount of evil in the Lord's sight. The implications of these belief systems, in a word, could be absolutely horrific. Child sacrifice. They would do anything to change the fate or to appease the deities. The levels of brutality were simply inconceivable. Yahweh's covenant with Israel, compared to the way things worked on the national stage of the day, was remarkably gracious and redemptive. Embedded in their laws, again, like Kevin prayed, embedded in their laws in Israel are statements like, if you gather, don't be so stingy that you can leave something for your neighbors who are hungry. Compare that with belief systems that are deeply embedded in the inner logic, would lead to or require a man to sacrifice his child in some way to appease these deities or to manipulate a future. Those are inconceivably different ways of operating. Almost, you couldn't think of two different ways of being. Well, Manasseh does this in the temple. It's a strike at the very heart of the covenant. Okay. Is there a future for us? Well, if you look at 2 Kings, look at how 2 Kings ends, all the way down in 2 Kings 25. The way it ends at the end of 2 Kings is the last king of Judah, Jehoiachin. We see a statement about the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon pardoned King Jehoiachin, this is 25 verse 27, and released him from prison. This is an interesting turn of phrase here. The client king of Judah is released from prison. He spoke kindly to him, set his throne over the thrones of the kings who were with him in Babylon. Jehoiachin changed his prison clothes and dined regularly in the presence of the king of Babylon the rest of his life. And he's given an allowance, and there the curtain comes down at the end of 2 Kings. It's awful tragedy. You think it's, and they lived happily ever after. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. The king of Judah is a lapdog for the king of Babylon, a little client king. How condescending to give an allowance to your rival opponent. In essence, we are right back where we were in Egypt, only in the worst possible way. Joseph had a position of power and influence. Jehoiachin is a little dependent vassal, a little dependent king. The whole thing has been reversed. Is there a future? Well, if you're reading 2 Kings and you're reading Exodus, you would think, I don't know if there is a future, but if there is a future, it will be because God honors His promise. It will not be because Israel has great prospects. It will not be because Israel, if they just pull it together this time, okay? If you look at the end of Exodus 40, they renew covenant, and there is a future for Israel after this great tragedy with the golden calf. There is a future. Go through the chapters of the 30s, and they build the tabernacle. God's presence is with His people. Is there a future for us? The answer is yes, there is a future for us. If we're reading it during the exile, is there any hope for us? Yes, there is hope for you. It ends with God's presence among His people. It ends where we have wanted to be the whole time. In the whole arc of this story, we've wanted the people of God in the land of God, dwelling in the presence of God. That's just what we have in Exodus 40. Okay, we can't stop there. We're going to get to Advent, right? Look at John 1. This is the end. This is the last thing I'll say as you look at John 1 and look at what John says when he talks about what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through Him, and apart from Him, not one thing was created that has been created. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled among us. We observed His glory, the glory as the one and only Son from the Father. Just where Exodus ends, God in Christ manifests His presence with us and His glory among us. Is there future? Yes. Okay. Thank you for your patience. I told you I was going to get there. I had to get there. It's worth